My name is Shrey, and I'm a fourth year at the University of Arizona College of Medicine in Tucson. And I'm going to be pursuing a career in family medicine. And today I'm going to be sharing with you a condensed version of a leadership training framework for dealing with disruptive and bias-related behavior on academic medicine work teams. So before jumping into it, I just wanted to share a bit of context about the training so that you kind of have an idea of where it came from. In 2020, as many of you know, many institutions recommitted to anti-racism in medicine and began forming committees and bolstering ODI work as racial injustice sort of rose to the front of the broader American public consciousness. And my institution, the University of Arizona, did the same and formed a faculty development committee, which I was asked to co-chair along with two of our amazing faculty members, Dr. Min, an emergency medicine physician, and Dr. Ortiz, our director of our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So in that faculty development committee, conversations with the faculty on the committee quickly revealed that they sort of felt stuck when dealing with disruptive and bias-related behavior in the workplace. And the issue was that if academic medicine doesn't train developing physicians in workplace leadership and conflict management, how can they really be expected to handle disruptive behavior and bias-related incidents effectively? And I've always been really interested in leadership skills, so I was excited to think about possible solutions. So Dr. Kampa's presentation was very much aligned with addressing that problem, and this training is as well. And so I developed a framework and a training, and I brought it back to the committee for feedback. We decided to run with it, and Drs. Ortiz, Min, and myself delivered it to a number of faculty and administrative staff cohorts, probably close to 100 people total. And about halfway through, we ran a program evaluation, which led to my participation in the Bin Gap Writing Fellowship and this project. So traditionally, this is a 2-hour training with a breakout room activity, but for the purposes of today, we'll just focus on the core content. And I'll be sharing with you the presentation that we delivered to faculty at our institution with some interactive portions as well. So if you have any questions during the program, during the training, please feel free to stop me. All right, so to begin with, I want to recognize that everyone is a leader and has leadership skills, and everyone has sort of had their own unique journey with leadership skills. And so I'm wondering if anybody would be willing to share an answer to this question, which is, when and how did you learn to handle difficult situations or disruptive behavior in a work environment? Does anybody have any thoughts about this?
Sure, I can take a shot. So I was someone who always found myself being involved in things I had no business being involved in. And I think that's part of being a leader, as well as kind of being either nominated for things or asked to do things. And so I think I started becoming interested in addressing difficult situations and kind of took some of the clinical training I had received around motivational interviewing, and early on applied the same training I would do with my patients to these, like the disruptive behaviors at work, or I would use those same tools early on before I got formal leadership training.
Yeah, okay, that's a great example. And of course, Dr. Kampa, from your examples, we know that you really have a knack for handling these situations well. So it sounds like kind of drawing from your clinical experience and applying that more broadly to interactions with coworkers or teams that you were leading was an effective strategy as you learn to deal with patient emotions, for example. Is that a fair summary? Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. So kind of learning from the clinical experience. Does anybody else have any avenues through which they sort of learned how to deal with difficult situations in the workplace? Looks like on Dr. Obali's screen, you've got somebody.
Should I go?
Yeah, please.
Oh, we lost the sound.
We can hear you.
You can hear me? Oh,
Yeah.
We're echoing.
Just got rid of it.
Oh, thank you. Val Romero Leggett, actually borrowing the computer from my colleague here. So, but I was going to say, I love that example because I was thinking the exact same thing in terms of your clinical skills. I'm a family practice doc from University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center, and I am vice president for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is like great question, but I would say, and I think part of why we're getting this training is that we don't like, you don't formally learn, right? So a lot of things are end up being like on the job, like it just happens, and then you don't have that formal training like we're hoping to learn here today. So I was actually thinking the exact same thing you were just talking about in terms of motivational interviewing and kind of what you do with your patients. I guess the other thing that I think I learned some skill sets with, and again, not the formal training, was when we learned some negotiation skills. And we learned those pieces of things. I think being able to, again, apply some of those. But I really was very fascinated by this too, today's training, because again, I think we don't often get the training in leadership that we should for definitely difficult disruptive behavior. I think in some way, because you're a leader, you're supposed to, oh my gosh, you just automatically know that. We were born with that. Like we knew that. Heck
Right.
no. So thank you for this, and excited to hear, but I just wanted to share that little bit. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Romero. I think that is exactly encapsulates why this training. So the goal is really to recognize that there is an absence of formal leadership training, and I as a trainee who's going into residency, I see residents all the time being put in these de facto leadership roles, and yet I wonder, when will I get that training about how to do that effectively? And so we can pull from our different experiences, and I think recognizing that each of us is a leader and has that ability to come up with really novel solutions to difficult situations is really powerful. And then coming together and talking about creating systems for how do we really systematically approach these types of conflicts is really valuable. So this was the opener, and we'll skip this next question since we kind of addressed it a little bit. But what do you wish you had learned that you didn't lead earlier? Well, we talked about the absence of that formal training. So thank you both for those comments. I want to quickly just share the learning objectives after that opener for the presentation today. And the learning objectives are that by the end of this training, hopefully you should be able to explain the importance of steward leadership, explain the consequences of failing to guide a team through healing after a disruptive behavior, convey the necessary components of a good leader's approach to disruptive behavior in the workplace, and lastly, to formulate a holistic strategy for guiding all involved team members through healing after disruptive behavior. All right, so what I like to do next is begin by introducing a concept that many of you may already be familiar with. And I want to explore what it means to be a steward for the people that we work with. So this is something that we're often rarely taught, and yet again is expected of us all the time. And often in medicine, it's really not emphasized just how much responsibility we hold over the experiences of the people around us and under our supervision. Where, suddenly you're just on a team and you're the de facto team leader. And there was no real conversation about, well, what does that really mean? And so the word stewardship means the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. So stewardship is a model of leadership that's really oriented around taking care of others. And in this training, we're going to look at how do we handle disruptive behavior and bias-related behavior in the workplace as a leader in a way that really takes care of everyone on our team. And so I like to say that this is about care and compassion. And compassion comes from the Latin compati, which means to suffer together. And so for me, this means seeing how our suffering is linked, how when one suffers, we sort of all suffer. And so how do we, as stewards for the people around us, prevent suffering by helping our team heal when disruptive behavior like microaggressions or bias-related incidents, when those things cause harm? But first, what I'd like to do is explore what happens when we don't take care of our team. So not speaking up or dealing with difficult situations that affect team dynamics or interpersonal dynamics is obviously problematic for practical reasons. But I'm wondering, what are some possible consequences on an academic medicine team of not dealing with disruptive or bias-related behavior on a team early and decisively? Does anybody have any thoughts?
I think it can make the suffering more intense.
Yeah.
There was a recent example. I just took over a team and there was a lot of fighting before I went on. And one of the interns said, I have AVNRT, and my AVNRT was re-triggered because it was so stressful that I now am in an intermittent arrhythmia. And I was like, okay.
Wow.
So I think it's like when you don't, even though it's so hard to talk about sometimes, when you don't address it, it just can get larger and larger, even in the time when nothing is happening.
That's a really great point, that the sort of latent emotional energy that gets created by these things can actually have physiologic impacts on us, on team members. It can really negatively harm us to have just something heavy looming over a team that just hasn't really been addressed. Any other thoughts? What else are the consequences?
I would add to that. I think, it can sort of start this cascade where there's really this sort of a lack of care may then lead to perceptions of a lack of trust and sort of a stopping or a breakdown in communications, and then ultimately like a breakdown of the team effectiveness as a whole. I mean, it's sort of like a little wound that just sort of gets bigger and bigger. But I think it can, I think the care, on the flip side, I think that care implies respect, implies, and then that facilitates like honest communications, and even in challenging circumstances. And then that leads to more team effectiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said, that these things can very easily spiral, and you can get, poor wound healing, if we put it that way, that if we don't really address the necessary elements of healing, that things can get much, much worse. Does anybody else want to add anything?
I would add, Shrey, I think I'm the only person who's not a physician here, but I think the patient care then is really sacrificed if you don't have a good team that works together and they take care of each other. It can lead to mistakes. It can lead to other problems of the patient care.
Absolutely. And no, thank you, Dr. Abali. I mean, I think, obviously academic medicine and medicine in general is a team effort, and we rely on everybody to really identify what the problems are. And it's pretty obvious that patient care could suffer as a result of not addressing these things. So thank you for pointing that out. So yeah, these are the examples that we came up with, but a lot of them have been covered. So people can be harmed, resentments can build, views of one another can harden, mistrust and distrust can grow, misunderstandings can get worse. We can become less charitable and forgiving with one another, a little quicker to the trigger. And ultimately, all of this can get in the way of serving patients, which is really, one of the most important outcomes we really care about, because that's why we're in medicine and involved in academic medicine. Okay. So I want to share this quote by Audre Lorde, who many of you may be familiar with. She was a poet, a scholar, an activist. And she said that if I do not use my power, however relative it is, if I do not find out what it is and learn to use it, someone else is using it. And so I want to talk about using our power constructively. So I think somebody pointed this out in Dr. Kampa's presentation, but everybody really does have some political capital or some power in any situation. And situations have momentum. If we don't use our power to constructively influence how things unfold, then those negative events will spiral just by virtue of their own momentum. And so building resilience on our teams is really about taking a sense of leadership and ownership and stewardship over our team dynamics, because that can build resilience. So we don't just feel done to, and so we feel more empowered to step up. So leadership is really recognizing when you have people in your charge that you are responsible for. Again, we're often not told when we're in those positions, but just by default we are. And even being a team member, I think, can involve leadership. So if, for example, you have more experience or more skill handling difficult situations, even if you're not in charge of the team, you have power that you can use constructively to really influence other people's experiences. And as a trainee, I saw this all the time with residents, where they had a lot of power to influence how our team dynamic played out. Residents with naturally more leadership ability were able to sort of fill that role. Okay. So I want to just cover a few considerations before we talk about really dealing with disruptive behavior. And these are considerations that really emerge from conversations with faculty, and considerations that we don't want to just pretend like they aren't there, because there are real challenges to dealing with these situations. So the first thing is, it's important to think about your relationship to all the involved parties before getting involved. So are you a peer? Are you a direct supervisor? Are you a supervisor of a completely different team? So knowing this shouldn't necessarily inhibit you from doing something, but I think it can really inform how you approach, and with what tone, with what authority, with kind of what energy you approach the situation. Another consideration is, how can I mitigate harm while stepping up? So if I step up on someone else's behalf, how do I do so in a non-paternalistic way? And if there's concern for retaliation, how can I ensure that everybody involved feels safe and supported? So there's no one answer to these questions, but I just want to put them on your radar, because these are really important considerations to think about, and they'll surely come up. And then lastly, I want to emphasize that it's not just about coming up with the perfect thing to say in the moment. It's really about knowing how to handle a situation in its entirety appropriately, making sure everybody feels taken care of. So although it is about people's feelings, it's also not just about that. It's about making sure that we have good working relationships that are not easily fractured by disagreements or differing viewpoints, so that we can ultimately accomplish a shared mission. Okay. And so to that end, I want to introduce ACT UP. So ACT UP is a novel framework for thinking about steps that good leaders and teams tend to take when dealing with situations where the team dynamic is disrupted and some harm is done. And when I say novel, I mean the acronym is novel, but these steps are really just steps that good leaders have naturally developed, and I've sort of accumulated them from conversations with good leaders. And so these are just steps that people recognize are important to do, that are just sort of put together in a cute little acronym. So again, it's not that good leaders always follow the exact same steps or go through things in the exact same order, but a set of steps can be extrapolated from good leaders' experiences. And these actions tend to fall in 5 rough categories. So the first is to acknowledge and stop any inappropriate behavior in the moment. So if you're in the moment when some harm is being done, being able to acknowledge that it's happening and stop it in some way. Then to check in with the harmed party one-on-one. Then to talk to the harming party one-on-one to hear their perspective. Then to update the harmed party about any steps that were taken. Going back to this idea of sort of closed loop communication, closing the loop with the harmed party. And then lastly, if necessary, to process the event with the team, especially if others were affected, or if others heard what happened or saw what happened, and maybe just need to be touched base with, to feel heard and listened to and supported as well. So if you develop a reliable record handling these situations really well, then people will feel more comfortable bringing these workplace issues to you, especially if you weren't there. And these steps, I think, can really help do that, just remembering to run through them. All right. So far, we've been speaking in generalities about disruptive behavior and negative situations, but what kinds of situations are we really talking about? So to illustrate this, what I'd like to do is I'd like to read a story, and I'd like to invite you all to turn off your video, close your eyes, or whatever feels comfortable to you. I'd like to read through this story, and afterwards invite you back and we'll debrief together. And this story was developed with the help of a member of our faculty development committee on our anti-racism and medicine committees, who has a lot of leadership experience, and actually saw a story very similar to this unfold. So I'm gonna read the story. Again, feel free to close your eyes, turn off your video, whatever feels comfortable as I read through it. Okay. So at the end of a long day, a few surgical residents, Emilio, Devin, and Brian, and two surgery attendings, Doctors Johnson and Barger, were in the changing room, changing out of their scrubs. The surgery they had just come out of had been a long and technically challenging one, and there were some tense moments. On one side of the locker room were the residents, and on the other side, the attendings, but both were within clear hearing distance of one another, and the two attendings were in conversation about surgical techniques. At one point, the older of the two attendings, Dr. Barger, commented, "Schools are just letting everyone in these days with all these diversity programs. I mean, where's the quality control?" Dr. Johnson, aware that the residents could easily hear what was being said and aware that the comment was directed at their non-white racial backgrounds, felt uncomfortable and redirected the conversation before gradually turning his attention to the residents and making small talk with them. The residents finished changing, said goodbye, and left together, followed by Dr. Barger, then Dr. Johnson shortly after. Feeling badly about what had happened, Dr. Johnson saw the residents walking ahead of him on the way to the parking lot and caught up to them. He apologized to them for what the other attending had said and for saying nothing, and acknowledged that it made him uncomfortable to hear his younger colleagues disrespected like that. He asked them how they felt and was met with gratitude for his apology, but also a feeling of disappointment that they just had to take those kinds of comments. Resolving to speak to his colleague, the attending told the residents that he would address the situation tomorrow. The residents communicated that they didn't want to make any waves, and Dr. Johnson assured them that he would not make it about them. The next morning, Dr. Johnson pulled aside Dr. Barger. Dr. Johnson expressed that he was personally offended by the comment yesterday and communicated that he felt there was no place for those kinds of comments on a team. Although Dr. Barger was initially somewhat resistant to the confrontation, Dr. Johnson persisted and just emphasized his request that Dr. Barger refrain from commenting on the competency and skill level of their colleagues who they are responsible for training. Dr. Barger, although not enthusiastic, eventually agreed to watch himself going forward, noting that the culture is changing and that he'll just have to adapt. Dr. Johnson thanked him and went on to round on his patients. Later that day, Dr. Johnson made an effort to pull aside each of the residents. He let each of them know that he had spoken to Dr. Barger, and he notified them that he agreed to refrain from inappropriate comments like that going forward. He asked them how they were feeling about things, and after hearing that they were doing okay, he encouraged each of them to let him know if something like this happened again. They each thanked Dr. Johnson, feeling appreciative for his check-in. Okay, so I'd like to invite you back. If you turned off your camera, open your eyes, rejoin us. And I'd like to ask you all if anybody had any initial thoughts that they wanted to share hearing this story.
Hi, my name is Joanna. I'm a fourth year from CUNY School of Medicine. So as a fellow MS4, I'm sure you know, like we went through application season. And so this story was just reminding me of this past season, there were, because each specialty kind of has group chats for their specialty. And so there just so happened to be a Reddit thread for the emergency applicants where a lot of not the white applicants were complaining about diverse applicants getting more invitation offers and speaking in terms of that students are just getting offers because programs need to hit diversity ratios and they're not as competent as we are, such as, and I just feel like stories like this, these things are so general, like they happen so frequently, both in person and now in the online sphere. And I think in that situation, I like that it was addressed, but I would have preferred if it had been addressed in the moment. I feel like not many people will defend you in the moment, if that makes sense. Like it's okay to be an ally or an advocate behind closed doors, but you don't have the confidence or the wherewithal to do it in person. And I don't know, something about that doesn't sit well with me. Nice.
Yeah, I hear where you're coming from, Joanna, and I really appreciate you sharing that obviously it would have been better to say something in the moment, right? It would have maybe felt a little more protective, or a little more like somebody was really standing up against something wrong in the moment. And so there is that sense that things could have been done better. And that's the goal of this story, is to really demonstrate something real. It's not perfect, but these kinds of situations are pretty common, like you pointed out. Did anybody else have any initial reactions before we jump into a little bit of a more formal debrief of the story?
I think that I always think about this. So I conceptualize it as calling in versus calling out. And I have very accidentally, very much publicly humiliated people by calling them out. But have also seen examples and have developed my own approaches to being able to call people out in a way that is respectful. And I've seen there are very few people that I've seen do it well. But I've definitely taken note, because I think that was it Dr. Johnson, like the fact that he, did address it in some way is great. And I think that many people don't address it at all. And so I guess better is better than doing nothing, right? Some addressing is better than doing nothing. But I do think there are ways to thoughtfully and respectfully in the moment say, what you just said is not appropriate and very, very hurtful, both to me and to the students. And I just think that, I don't know if that was your intent. There are ways to do it, but it can be a tough, sticky situation. And oftentimes as colleagues, we're wanting to be seen as good colleagues. Like, you want to protect the people below you, but you also want to be thought of as a safe space for your peers as well. So it's always balancing the priorities, which can be a difficult thing to do.
Absolutely. I think that's very well said. And, I want to bring it back to something we talked about a little earlier as well, which is, those power dynamics. Dr. Barger is the senior attending. Dr. Johnson probably has his own set of fears and emotions. And so part of the goal of this training, as we delivered it to faculty, was really to recognize that faculty are not just robots who we just say, you need to do better. These are challenging situations, and they may have emotions too that are difficult. So I'm getting a little bit of echo or feedback somewhere. I'm not sure where it's. Oh, there we go. Okay. So what I'd like to do next is jump into a bit more of a formal debrief. And I want to run through the steps of ACT UP. And I want to ask you if it was present, how you felt about the step, etc. So since we've already talked about this a little bit and recognized that there wasn't really an attempt to acknowledge or stop the behavior right in the moment, I just want to draw your attention to something subtle that maybe you picked up on, which is, Dr. Johnson was clearly uncomfortable in the moment. And you might have noticed in the story as I read it that he tried to redirect the energy from that comment towards conversing with the residents a little bit. And so it was very subtle. It was by no means a direct acknowledgement. But that was, I would say, the extent of the acknowledgement. And so I want to ask you all how you feel about that, what thoughts, maybe your feelings you might have in the moment, or fears that might prevent you from sort of doing that in the moment acknowledgement. And I want to ask you that, recognizing that, a lot of traditional bystander trainings are all about how do you target it right in the moment? How do you say the most perfect, clever, pithy comment to get right in it and stop it and change hearts and minds? A very difficult thing to do sometimes. So what would your emotions and fears or barriers be to acknowledging it in the moment? And what did you think of Dr. Johnson in that situation?
Sure. I think after Joanna talked, I felt that sometimes I'm baffled from what I'm hearing, and I cannot react at the moment, and I feel very upset with myself, but I'm just cannot find the words to address that. And it happened to me several times, within different situations. So it's like this amazement that you will hear this coming from a colleague there, from their mouth.
Absolutely. I think that is so relatable. Just sort of being a little like, oh man, what do I do? Like, did I hear that properly? And you almost feel a little paralyzed. That's very real. Any other thoughts? Well, I think what I really want to emphasize with this part is, we know it's challenging. And the reality is, how many of us have kicked ourselves afterwards that, oh, I should have said this, or man, if I had only thought of this perfect one-liner, or this perfect way of creating a bit of tension, I would have gotten it. But I think that this real world story shows us that in the moment, we may not always have the foresight, the insight, or even the courage or speed in the moment to say something perfect. And I want to also say that that's okay. Acknowledging things afterwards can also be healing. I think sometimes we may fall into a trap of feeling that if I don't get it right in the moment, that it's over and I guess I'll just have to deal with it next time. There is still things that can be done to heal a situation, and those things can still be valuable for facilitating healing. And so I want to jump into the next one and ask you, where was the scene? Did someone check in with the people who were potentially harmed about the comment? How did that go? What did it look like? And how did you feel about it?
I don't remember specifically. Were the residents checked in on separately or like as a group?
So as they were leaving the locker room, Dr. Johnson caught up with the group of residents as they were getting to the parking lot and spoke to them together.
Okay. I think I'm glad that they were checked in on after such a comment, but I feel like it would have been more effective, impactful, probably, had it been done with each of them separately. I feel like in certain situations, I mean, of course, a comment like that shouldn't be said and is wrong, but it can affect people differently depending on their own experiences, depending on how, like, what their level of emotional, like, there's a lot of ways that it can impact someone separately. So as a group, it might not have been the best way to address it, because had they been talked to separately, one may have said, oh, I'm used to it, this happens before. Another one may have started crying and said, this is just horrible. Like it's I think it's important to check in on everyone, like one-on-one. I think that was in the acronym too, but like to check on people one-on-one, just so that they have a moment also to feel safe and vulnerable in that moment. It's very hard to do that, I feel like, in bigger group settings, even if you are comfortable with your co-residents. So I think that was the only thing that I would have kind of pointed out about this check-in moment. But other than that, I'm glad that the residents were checked in on as soon as possible after the incident.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said, Joanna, that it can be really valuable to have that one-on-one and create space for whatever is going on in that individual person to share. Absolutely, that probably would have been more ideal. Any other thoughts about the check-in step, which you liked or didn't like, or maybe in your style, which you would have done differently? So one comment we've gotten in some of our faculty cohorts is that, perhaps one thing that was lacking is asking the residents what they would like to see happen. But one thing I want to draw your attention to is a comment that one of the residents made when Dr. Johnson said, hey, I'm going to address this tomorrow. That's my commitment to you. One of the things one of the residents said, does anybody remember what one of them said?
I believe they were worried about any form of like retribution or backlash after addressing it.
Yeah, that sounded like the motivation behind the comment. Does anybody remember what the comment was?
Like they didn't want to make a big deal out of it or something. Like
yeah, they didn't want to make any waves. Hey, I'm not trying to, draw any attention. I don't want to make any waves, right? So I want to draw your attention to the fact that there's often a little bit of a tension here, which is needing to balance what the residents want, which in this case was kind of just to stay under the radar, with the need of leaders to confront inappropriate behavior and create culture change. And so one of the things I want to highlight is that there's often a need to actually demonstrate leadership and help trainees see that dealing with situations head on, even if it is uncomfortable, can be done in a constructive way that doesn't ultimately harm them. But that comes with a need to protect them from retaliation. So sometimes, trainees may, oftentimes as a trainee, I would often hear, when I would hear faculty talking about this stuff, like, oh, we need to do what they want. We need to make sure that, it's what the trainees want, what the RET students want, what they want to see things look like. But so often I speak to my classmates and oftentimes we are confused or unsure or don't have leadership experience or have only seen things handled badly. And so often there's a need for that mentorship and leadership to guide even trainees through how to create culture change, even when it's uncomfortable. And that can be a little bit of a difficult situation to navigate, but I think is an important one to recognize that, people who are victimized are not just pure victims who, that there's a process for everybody to learn and grow through these situations to cultivate that growth so that one day they can see, oh, hey, Dr. Johnson handled that really well. Now I can model some of those skills as well instead of, needing to avoid handling it. All right, so let's jump into the next step.
I was just going to say as well, excuse me for interrupting, but I really appreciate that perspective. That's important. And the manner in which you bring it up to your colleague, right? Like how you mentioned about the protecting, right? So it's like, oh, resident X, Y, and Z said this, or like, so you need them. There's the trust issue that came up a minute ago too. Like you have to know how to do that in the way that you are protecting people and you're making it about the comment itself and that person, not about, so-and-so said this or felt this way, or I know the residents feel this way, or, something where, again, it puts them at risk because of that power differential as well. So, yeah, I think it takes certainly an understanding about that too, because there are a lot of times really good intentions, and then you inadvertently like, oh my gosh, you just kind of put somebody in a very vulnerable situation.
It's a great point. And that's something we're actually going to touch on later because it draws attention to another tension in handling these situations. So that's very, very prescient of you. Thank you, Dr. Romero. We're going to get back to that. So I want to jump into the next step, which is the T. Dr. Johnson, does anybody want to comment on how Dr. Johnson approached the talk with the person who did the harming, how that went, what it looked like, how you felt about it?
So just like Dr. Romero Leggett was saying, I definitely took note of the fact that Dr. Johnson made it about him, right? He said, I'm going to make it about, he kind of promised that to the residents. It's not going to be about you. And I think that was very deliberate. And I think that was very well done, right? Because it was it was about him and Dr. I think Berger, and I think it protected the residents, but then it also made probably the conversation more effective because it's not just hearsay. Right now, this is directly like, this is how I felt when you said that. So I thought that I thought that was the right way to talk to the senior attending.
Yeah, the language he used was, I was personally offended by what I heard. It's not about anybody else. Like I was there and I didn't like what I heard. So he kind of made it about him, which seemed like an effective strategy or an interesting one at least. Yeah. Any other thoughts about this and what this looked like, how you felt about it?
I think at the end of their interaction, the senior attending said something along the lines of that the culture has changed and he just has to, I don't like that it ended on that point because I think he kind of took it as, oh, things are different now. I just have to be more PC as opposed to actually acknowledging that he has an internalized bias that he needs to overcome, that he is like the way that he interacts with people will be influenced by this discriminatory mindset. And he wasn't necessarily thinking about it from the point of view of what I said was wrong. He was just thinking about it as I said it in the wrong place or around the wrong people.
It's a great observation, Joanna. I think it's an important one because it draws to another key point that I really want to highlight. So I'm going to come back to that. First, I want to sort of summarize what we've heard. So Dr. Johnson did step up, right? He did something, and that is what is important. It is important that he had the courage to ultimately go back and deal with his mistake of not having spoken up in the moment. He let the residents know that somebody was looking out for them, and he tried to be accountable to them. Now, as for how effective the conversation with Dr. Barger will be, only time will tell. But what Joanna's pointing out is that something that I hear a lot from classmates, from a lot of people in these trainings, which is that, we often really hope for this emotional catharsis. We really hope that the person is going to come around and be like, you know what, you're right. That was a racist comment. That was, I need to investigate my privilege. I need to check myself at the door, like all of this. We hope, right, that that's going to happen. But alas, we know that thought control doesn't work, right? It's really hard to change hearts and minds. And sometimes we may not be the right messenger. How often have we been in a situation where maybe we've said something and didn't understand the implications until later, until another situation? I can't tell you how many times I've made the same mistake over and over and over again until eventually it sticks. So I just want to highlight that often we can't control people's emotions and responses to our confrontations. We may also not have the tools to make it very effective initially, but that shouldn't necessarily be a barrier from doing something. And so I think what I want to draw attention to is that Dr. Johnson really communicated a bottom line, right? He said that, hey, I just think these comments, when we're training these individuals to be the best physicians that we would want to take care of us, we can't be making these comments. So I just want to set that bottom line. And that can be a really valuable tool, strategy in an environment where maybe you're not getting that catharsis that you want. You're not getting Dr. Barger to come around. Maybe you can at least communicate a bottom line. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's very fair, right? I mean, it's true. Like, we all have hope, right? And we all want certain things. But I think that's fair because, again, one of the main things is not to be making those comments, right? And to just not say those and create everything that comes from that. So that's already a win there. But it was so funny. And as Joanna was talking, and because I thought that was just a great pickup. And I was thinking, yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing then we'd say like, oh, now we need some more training, like one of these sessions for our residents and attendees, right? And like to do something, to bring this out, because I mean, that's the way you start. A lot of times, I mean, if you're going to change, right, people are like, then just little by little, hopefully as you're educating or you're bringing these conversations and making it kind of the norm a little bit more, starts helping us get to that other place where we want to be and where we should be. With implicit bias with all of these, right? It's really about the some of the educational parts of it. So as you were talking, Joanna, and as I had heard some of that, I thought, oh my gosh, this is a perfect opportunity, right? Like you do it in other ways then, and you just try to make those, move the needle as you can along that.
Absolutely. Very well said. It's bit by bit, right? Dr. Abali, did you have something you were going to share?
Yes, I was going to say in the lines of what Dr. Ramara mentioned is that I wonder if Dr. Johnson then went to the diversity and inclusion and say, do we have training for this? Something like that. He doesn't have to give the name of the other doctor's name, but he can say, I see that, we need some training in our wards about this or something like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So actually, that's a great jumping off point. I want to move to the next slide where we talk about the last couple steps. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about these ones. So for the U, in terms of updating, this is really important for that closed loop communication. The update step is really important because it's the step that I think really facilitates the healing that can't happen without closing the loop. So when you update and you check in again, what you're communicating to what he communicated to the residents is really that, hey, there's follow through here, that you can actually trust when I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. And that builds trust. And that is, and trust is one of the pathways to healing. So I want to really emphasize how important that step is. And checking in with the residents one-on-one might involve referral to other services if it's a really egregious situation, they're really hurt by it. It might involve a referral to mental health services and supporting them in that way. But with regards to what Dr. Abali was just saying, processing is something that can happen in a lot of different ways. So perhaps if there were other witnesses to the situation as well, beyond just the 3 residents who aren't directly involved, some kind of a group conversation, might be helpful, or programming. You can recognize that, hey, I'm seeing a lot of these things happen. Maybe one way to process this is to actually depersonalize it and just have a training to talk about some of these things. And maybe that would be an effective way. So the processing step can look like many different things: group conversations or further programming and training and calling in the relevant parties to bring that to the group. Okay, so to kind of summarize our debrief, I want to really, really highlight that this is not at all meant to be a rigid script, but a flexible process. And I want to also highlight that any one step can be helpful, that it's important to think about things holistically. So sometimes if the in-the-moment acknowledgement and intervention, sometimes if that doesn't happen, like in this case, doing the subsequent steps can be really healing and helpful still. On the other hand, sometimes doing the A step means that the later steps don't have to happen as much because you've sort of nipped the situation in the bud by acknowledging and preventing further harm from being done. Checking in is still always a good idea, but it's a very dynamic process. And it's kind of like a checklist. Hey, how do I make sure that I can facilitate healing? Running through these steps and seeing which one is the most appropriate. And so in this way, ACT UP can be a very flexible process. Does anybody have any last comments they want to share about this? Any last thoughts about this story and our debrief about it?
I thought this was great. I guess I have one question. And are we like at the very end on your time?
We have maybe about like 10 minutes left of the presentation, and then there's
okay.
15
You might
minutes
get there,
for
so I'm
Q&A.
going to just hold my comments for now. No, I thought well done. It was a good case, and I had like some nuances in there and things. So appreciated that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I want to jump into just a few kind of closing slides that summarize some more consideration. So this slide is called Tools in the Toolbox, and one way to think about, what tools do we have access to in situations like this when we're in leadership situations? Well, we have a number of tools that are available in social situations, and some of them are more serious and confrontational than others, and they all have their unique pros and cons. And so I just want to run through some of them because they can all be useful when used appropriately and depending on our comfort level. They can help us change the energy of a situation that might otherwise cause someone to feel marginalized. And I also want to highlight that one thing I learned, I used to work in HIV counseling, and one thing I learned was it's really important to do what feels natural to you, to challenge yourself, but to do what feels natural. So, putting your hand on a shoulder, if that's not natural for you, then doing it will come off as stiff and really uncomfortable when you're delivering a positive result, for example. So it's really important to do what feels natural to you. And what feels natural to you will grow and evolve. So that's something that has always stuck with me, and I think is really useful to think about, that we all have our own styles, and that can be really important. Okay, so jumping into these tools in the toolbox. So the first one I want to highlight is humor. So sometimes humor can help us refocus a situation onto the offending party in an appropriate and non-bullying way. And it can redirect the lens onto them and off of the harmed individual. So for example, one example I heard that I thought was funny was a male doctor makes a sexual innuendo towards a female doctor, and an observing doctor comments, "Oh, is this like one of those tacky 80s workplace videos about what a sexist comment looks like? Nice one." So it's a little bit of humor, makes the butt of the joke a little bit the person who made the comment. Now, it's important to also recognize the cons, which is that humor can become a crutch, and it has to be used responsibly. And if it's not natural to you, if you're not that person, it just might not be the right tool to use in that moment. Withholding approval and creating social discomfort. So withholding laughter or other forms of social approval from somebody, if they're seeking that, can communicate through body language that you don't really find that entertaining. And that can be really powerful, actually. Just that subtle restraint can actually communicate a lot. So even in the moment when Dr. Barger is making the comment to Dr. Johnson, when Dr. Johnson redirected his attention and started talking to the residents, through that, he stopped feeding Dr. Barger's comment, and he was actually able to, in a very subtle way, stop further harm continuing. Now, it may not have been perfect. There was certainly more you could have done, but it was a step that can be helpful. Allyship. So positioning yourself on the side of a person or a group can reorient the dynamic of the situation. And this is something we've probably all done in subtle ways. So, somebody makes an unsolicited comment about how foul they think that type of ethnic food that you're eating smells. And somebody else says, oh, hey, I actually love that food. Did you make it yourself? And that suddenly that can change the dynamic, because now you're positioning yourself as on the side of somebody who maybe received a comment that made them uncomfortable. And then direct confrontation, pulling an offending party aside, having a one-on-one can often create space for reflection. This is what Dr. Johnson did with Dr. Barger. This is more useful for egregious and harmful situations. And then lastly, tag teaming, getting help from a friend or a colleague when confronting someone and they can give you support when holding a difficult conversation. All right, so some tools for having difficult conversations. All right, so the first one is something that we already talked about, which is focusing not on the harmed individual, but on you as a leader. So, hey, what you said or did made me feel really uncomfortable, and I wanted to talk to you about it and hear how you feel about it. It's much more effective than Devin was really offended by what you said. I mean, he really didn't like that. Instead making it about you. Now, this is probably very common for leaders in charge of teams, which is like, what if you weren't there and a situation is brought to your attention? So in this case, something like, I wanted to talk to you about a situation that came to my attention in which this happened. I wasn't there, but I care about making sure everybody feels comfortable. And I was wondering what happened from your perspective. And so this brings us to something that I think Dr. Romero kind of alluded to. And I want to really highlight it here, which is that being specific about the situation and behavior is really, really critical. So this often means acknowledging who specifically was harmed. Sometimes it may not be already clear because let's say there was a lot of people there and the person you're talking to may not know who brought it to your attention. I would say maybe probably a minority of cases where you weren't there, it's really possible to accomplish the goals of both being specific and protecting anonymity. But there is a tension between those things, between being specific and protecting anonymity. And I really want to highlight that in my conversations with faculty and with leaders and clerkship directors, if a confrontation is not specific, it is truthfully rarely helpful and can even actually be harmful. And the reason is because people who are talked to about behavior where there's all generalities and nothing specific, often they just feel this vague sense that I have a target on my back, but I have no idea what I did, because maybe they don't remember the comment. Maybe it was so insignificant to them. And often that can be a really difficult situation that doesn't actually facilitate growth and healing. And so sometimes it is necessary to actually sacrifice anonymity in order to be specific. And this is where it's really important to protect from retaliation. So as a leader, this may require helping people who raise concerns to you understand that if they would like meaningful action to be taken, anonymity may not be able to be preserved. And it may involve brainstorming with them different options. Like, here's one way I could go about it. Here's another way I could go about it. Here are the pros and cons. And I think that is also a process of mentorship as a leader. You're helping people see that to create culture change, it's really important to be specific. But I want to make sure that we're going to make sure that you're protected from any blowback and that there's avenues to make sure that you're protected. And it's a choice, ultimately. It does take courage and it can be challenging. But in order for an intervention to be really effective, that's an important step. So one example that often comes up is, med school evaluations. And so in that situation, it might be necessary, for example, to say, hey, I'm going to talk to this person, but if you get any negative evaluations that come in from that person, they're going to be scrutinized or excluded because I know that you've had this conflict with them. And so we'll make sure that there's no blowback in that way. Or you might say, you know what, I'm going to actually have this conversation with the person after you're done with your clerkship. And these are all ways, but it requires creative thinking and brainstorming, and also letting the person know that to have a really effective intervention with the person who made the harmful comment, being specific is really crucial. Okay, and then next, another tool can be determining if an apology is appropriate or not. Often people may not really be looking for an apology, and what's best for everyone may just be reflection and a return to respectful interactions rather than forcing an apology. All of these things are dynamic and really depend on the people you're dealing with. In certain situations, a mediated conversation between the harmed or offending party may be necessary. And then if the situation is very serious, rearranging teams so that the two parties don't continue working together is important, while further action is decided upon, involving higher ups, especially if there's some kind of harassment involved. And this should be done in a way that's not punitive to the harmed individual. And further follow-up is always really important for those very serious situations. A couple final comments before I open up for questions. One thing that often comes up is fear that our involvement may make a situation worse by prompting retaliation against the person we're intervening on behalf of. So I've heard this often that like, oh, I don't want to say anything because it's just going to make it worse for them. One thing that in my conversations with faculty and being in academic medicine and various leadership roles I've seen is that well, actually, one thing a mentor told me is that it's really important to remember that you have the right to be in a safe and happy work environment free of harassing behavior, even if that behavior is not directed at you. So, for example, Dr. Johnson, was in the presence of a comment that really didn't really have a place there. And so he doesn't have to just defer necessarily to what the residents wanted because he was there and he heard it as well. And he's able to say, you know what, I didn't like that. I didn't like what I heard. That's his right to do as well, since he was there. So it's important to recognize that we all have that ability and that fearing retaliation is often a way to keep things stagnant and paralyzed. So it's important to protect against retaliation, but we don't want to be paralyzed by that fear. And so retaliation should never really just be expected that it's going to happen, and appropriate steps should be taken to mitigate it so that steps can be taken to intervene. Again, I gave the example of med student evaluations. And really just remembering that we all have that right to a workplace environment that supports our growth and development towards the ultimate mission that we're there for, which in the context we're talking about is efficient and effective patient care. All right, so that is the last slide. Thank you all so much for your participation. I really enjoyed hearing your perspectives. I always learn so much from all the leadership experience that you all bring. But I want to open up to any questions or comments.
So thank you. I thought that was fantastic. I think all of us really appreciate the nuances that came out in that story, and really feeling that there are concrete tools, as you said, in the toolkit. One thing that you said that reminded me of something. So I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown. I think she's amazing, especially when it comes to leadership. And you talked about how I forget their names now, Dr. Johnson, I guess, when the junior attending spoke with the senior attending, at some point he sort of laid it out like this, there's really no place for this kind of comment. And you described it as sort of like the bottom line. And so Brene Brown talks about that as boundaries. And I think, we can have those difficult interactions. And if we state what those boundaries are, even if we're not effective at changing minds, even if it doesn't go anywhere for the other person, I think we can sort of hold our heads high and feel like we protected ourselves, we protected those that, like in this situation, the residents. And I think that's really important. And it's, it takes a lot of courage to do that. But oftentimes I think getting to that point where you can articulate those boundaries, you should consider that a victory. Right. Not necessarily getting, Dr. Barger to sort of be like, oh, sorry, but really just to say like, I got it out there. I was very, very clear about what was not okay. I think is really important and valuable.
Yeah, boundaries are a great way of framing it. And it reminds me of that phrase, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So often it's, I got to get this perfect or I won't do anything at all. But sometimes taking a step is something to rejoice in, because the more we practice that, the better we'll get at it. So I really like that.
This is not a comment, but I just wanted to say I work with Shrey, and I think he completed his merit portal submission. We're waiting to hear from Dr. Sanchez, and it's ready to go. I think he did a wonderful job. Thank you.
Thank you,
sir.
Dr. Bali, for all your help.
We agree. We agree. I
Thank
did,
you.
one comment I was going to make was in the tools and toolbox on the direct confrontation, I think that was not what did it say? What was that?
Yeah.
I think because the one I think people have more difficulty with, in essence, like I think we're more comfortable pulling someone aside and talking to them one-on-one in that kind of a direct. But in the moment, as Dr. Bali was saying a moment ago, it's like, shoot, like you're not sure how to think and get those words out quickly enough. But I think that's where sometimes having some little, some of those little terms, right, that you could use, or some segues to that, like that you can bring it up in that way, I think are very helpful. So in this toolbox, I would definitely add some of those, because I think that's the most challenging for people, is in the moment. But just having a few of those catchphrases is really, I mean, if you have a couple of those, you can practice them enough and be able to bring those up that would allow you to at least try it, once in a while, or be able to do that. But I
That's
thought
great. Yeah.
so good. I love this. It was great.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, actually, I just shared in the chat a tip sheet that we sent out to all of our participants, which just has, phrases, conversation starters, ways to think about it. So I sent that to you all, but yeah, absolutely. I think it's really helpful to just have some of those phrases rehearsed sometimes so that you have something to start with.
Yes,
Yeah, thank you. And had you sent that to everyone? Like I should have already gotten that too.
it's in the chat.
No,
But just in the chat now. Okay.
Yeah,
I just
Okay,
sent it
good.
in the
I was like,
chat.
oh my gosh, I'm like missing things. So thank you. You already
No,
thought about it.
His
Thanks.
talk was much longer, and so those
that's
phrases
right.
are now is not there, but it's in his
That's
original
right.
presentation. They're all in there.
Oh, yeah. So you
So-
already thought about all this. So good job. Even better job. Thanks.
No, a lot of this stuff came from feedback like yours from the initial cohorts we ran, where people wanted phrases like that. So we put together this tip sheet, but absolutely, yeah. Great. Well, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you today.